Thank you for joining Detective Duo, your companion for stories of wit, charm, and quiet suspense, the kind Tommy and Tuppence might have uncovered in their early adventures. Subscribe for more of these mysteries, and let us know where you're listening from. The rattle of teacups was the only excitement of the Tuesday ladies' circle. In the vicarage parlour, where lace doilies fought a losing battle against cigarette smoke and lemon drizzle crumbs, Mrs. Tuppence Beresford sat regarding the proceedings with a look of polite despair. Mrs. Finch was discussing jam-making with the fervour of a zealot, and Miss Crimp, the schoolmistress, was expounding upon the price of margarine. The conversation circled, fluttered, and fell, until, as often happened when boredom lingered too long, someone mentioned something interesting. "I always said," declared Mrs. Blount, leaning forward, "that place was wrong. Widow's Lodge, I mean. Too lonely by half. And the sort of people that stayed there, oh, very secretive." "Widow's Lodge," Tuppence repeated, grateful for any topic not involving preserves. Mrs. Blount nodded importantly. "Out by Melford-on-Lee. A fine house once, now a boarding place for retired types. My cousin's friend lodged there after the war. Said she never slept a full night. Noises in the walls, lights in the attic, and once a man's voice calling her name when she was quite alone." Tuppence's blue eyes sharpened. "And she stayed?" "Oh, not after the second week. Packed her bags and went to Bath." The circle tittered. Tuppence, however, sipped her tea thoughtfully. It had been some time since anything more mysterious than a missing umbrella had crossed her path. When the meeting concluded, she walked home through the leaf-strewn streets off Soho Square, her mind alive with possibilities. Widow's Lodge. What a name. It fairly demanded adventure. At home, she found Tommy at the breakfast table, a comfortable scene of domestic disorder. A newspaper spread like a tent across his coffee cup, toast crumbs everywhere, and the wireless muttering faintly about Parliament. "You're late," he said cheerfully. "Did they elect you president of the Muffin Society?" Tuppence dropped her gloves on the chair. "Tommy, have you ever heard of a place called Widow's Lodge?" He peered over the paper. "Sounds like somewhere one goes to die of boredom. Why?" She relayed Mrs. Blount's gossip in animated detail. Tommy smiled indulgently, the corners of his mouth lifting in that mixture of fondness and exasperation that years of marriage had perfected. "My dear Tuppence, you've been retired from sleuthing for, 10 years? 15? 8, she corrected crisply. "And I see no reason why that should be permanent." Tommy folded his paper. Here we go. What's next? We rent the lodge, install secret microphones, and catch a phantom boarder with unpaid rent?" She ignored him and reached for the post, which lay neglected beside his teacup. Bills, circulars, and— her fingers paused. A thick cream envelope, its seal half burned. The handwriting was firm but uneven, as if written in haste. "Mrs. Tuppence Beresford, 10 Soho Square, London." She tore it open. Inside, on stationery faintly smelling of smoke, were a few lines. "My dear Beresfords, I require your discretion and presence at Widow's Lodge, Melford-on-Lee, at your earliest convenience. A matter of honour and of the past demands your judgment. Yours ever, Major P. Wilmot." For a moment, the name hung in the air like an echo from another life. "Wilmot!" Tommy exclaimed. "Good heavens, I haven't thought of him since 43. That business in Algiers, he was with intelligence." Tuppence's pulse quickened. "Exactly. And now he wants to see us. A matter of honour. How perfectly irresistible." Tommy frowned, rereading the letter. "It's vague, and why burn the seal? Trying to destroy the sender's mark, perhaps?" "Or hide it from prying eyes," said Tuppence. "And you'll notice he asks for discretion. That means secrecy, which means trouble. And you love trouble, Tommy. Don't deny it." He gave a resigned sigh that didn't conceal his amusement. "I like my trouble with breakfast, not a train ticket." But she was already at the escritoire, consulting Bradshaw's railway guide with the determination of a general plotting an invasion. "There's a 10:14 to Melford-on-Lee tomorrow morning. We'll take it. Pack something respectable. I doubt the Widow's Lodge is accustomed to glamour." Tommy leaned back, hands behind his head, watching her. "You've missed this, haven't you?" Tuppence smiled over her shoulder. "Missed it dreadfully." That night, the Beresfords dined quietly, though conversation kept drifting back to their wartime days. Wilmot had been a soldier of secrets, a man with a grave face and a habit of understatement. If he was calling now, After all these years, it could mean only that some fragment of the past had refused to die. Before bed, Tuppence laid the letter on her dressing table. The half-burned seal fascinated her. Its pattern, though mostly gone, showed the faint outline of a lion's paw. She touched it lightly, as though it might reveal its secret. "Tommy," she said softly, "you don't suppose Wilmot's in danger, do you?" He looked up from folding his tie. "He was always in danger, dear girl, but if he's asking for us, it must be something he can't trust to anyone else." Outside, the city murmured its eternal lullaby of car horns and footsteps. Yet beneath it all, Tuppence felt the stir of something older, a whisper of wartime codes and invisible enemies, the thrill of uncertainty. She turned out the light, her mind already at the widow's lodge. Morning brought new resolve. The train from Paddington cut through the countryside like a silver thread. Tuppence watched the fields roll by, patched in green and gold, while Tommy amused himself with the crossword. "5 down," he murmured, a word meaning deceit, 7 letters. Tuppence smirked. "Marriage," he chuckled. "You see, the old spark's alive." The rhythm of the train carried them toward Melford-on-Lee, toward the unknown. They spoke little after that, each absorbed in thought. At the small rural station, a porter directed them to a waiting cab. "Widow's Lodge?" he asked, glancing at them curiously. "Not many go there these days." "Why's that?" Tommy asked. The man shrugged. "Old house. Been through a lot. People say it's unlucky." Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy. "We make our own luck," she said briskly. As the cab rattled away through narrow lanes lined with autumn hedges, the air grew still. At last, the house appeared, a Georgian building standing aloof on a rise, its windows reflecting the pale sun. Not sinister precisely, but withdrawn, as though guarding its own memories. Tuppence pressed her gloved hands together. "Well, Tommy, it looks peaceful enough." He nodded slowly. "Yes, but so did Dunkirk before dawn." They climbed the steps and rang the bell. Somewhere inside, faintly, a clock chimed the hour, slow and deliberate. The door opened. A woman stood there, tall and composed, her hair a striking silver. "Mrs. Havers," she introduced herself. "You must be Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, Major Wilmot's guests." Her tone was calm, but something in her eyes flickered at the mention of Wilmot, something like fear. "Indeed," said Tuppence. "He wrote us rather urgently. Is he at home?" Mrs. Havers hesitated only a moment too long. "He stepped out. I expect him shortly." She ushered them inside, the air cool and faintly perfumed with lavender. On the mantel stood an array of framed photographs, soldiers, a wedding portrait turned face down, and a small carved lion's paw, polished smooth by handling. Tuppence stared at it, heart quickening. "Tommy," she whispered as Mrs. Havers moved away to fetch tea, "look, the same symbol as the seal." He nodded, his expression sharpening. "Our Major seems to have left us a trail." As the clock in the hall ticked solemnly on, the faint unease that had begun in London deepened into something else, an intuition that whatever waited within Widow's Lodge had roots in the past, and its shadow was only beginning to lengthen. Evening descended quietly. At dinner, conversation revolved around weather, post-war rationing, and the decline of manners. Tuppence noticed Mrs. Havers correct the Colonel with unusual sharpness when he mentioned Wilmot's army days. "Such matters are best left in the past," she said, with the finality of a gavel. Later, over tea, Miss Pringle startled them all by dropping her cup. "Forgive me," she gasped. I thought I saw someone at the window." "Reflexes, my dear," soothed the Colonel, though he looked himself and found nothing. Tuppence met Tommy's eyes across the table. Both were thinking the same thing. Too many nerves for one quiet house. When night settled over the countryside, Widow's Lodge grew strangely still. The creak of the old beams, the sigh of wind through chimneys, every sound seemed exaggerated, as if the house itself were listening. Tuppence, in her dressing gown, was brushing her hair when Tommy spoke from the window. "Someone's awake," he said quietly. She joined him. Far above, at the gabled corner of the roof, a light flickered behind an attic window, once, twice, then vanished. "Could be someone reading," she whispered. "At this hour?" The faintest echo of voices drifted through the night, muffled, indistinct. 2 people speaking quickly, Then silence again. Tommy's jaw tightened. I think Major Wilmot's affairs are rather more urgent than he admitted. Tuppence turned from the dark window, her face grave. If he's still alive, she said softly, he's trying to tell us something. In the hall below, the grandfather clock struck 11, slow and solemn. Tommy descended quietly, his torch angled low. He paused at the register table, opening it with care. Beneath the latest entries, faint but legible under the lamplight, 2 earlier names were visible, Mr. A. Denham and Mrs. A. Denham. Both crossed out. He frowned. Denham? A. D., he murmured. Do those initials ring a bell? Behind him a floorboard creaked. He spun round, only to find Mrs. Havers in her nightrobe, candle in hand, her expression composed but watchful. Mr. Beresford, she said quietly, may I ask why you are wandering the hall at this hour? Couldn't sleep, he said lightly. Too much mutton stew. Her lips curved slightly. One mustn't overindulge in curiosity either. It spoils the appetite. She turned and glided away before he could reply. When Tommy returned upstairs, Tuppence was waiting, alert. Well? He closed the door behind him. I'd say widows lodge houses more than paying guests. Then tomorrow, she said, we begin to find out exactly what. Outside, the wind moved softly in the trees, and somewhere high above, the attic window reflected a brief glimmer of light, as though acknowledging them both. Breakfast at Widow's Lodge began with the clink of china and the subdued hush of voices that knew too much. The morning paper lay folded on the sideboard, still damp from delivery, and the smell of toast hung uneasily in the air. Tuppence had just poured coffee when the front doorbell rang, a shrill, incongruous sound that seemed to pierce the quiet. Mrs. Havers crossed the hall swiftly, but the voice at the door carried through, a constable's tone, formal and subdued. When she returned, her face was the colour of unbaked dough. There's been an accident, she said. Major Wilmot. They've found him down by the river. The silence that followed was absolute. Found him? Tommy repeated slowly. Alive? Mrs. Havers shook her head. No, sir. The body was recovered early this morning. They believe he must have slipped in. The banks are treacherous after the rain. Rain. Tuppence hadn't noticed it in the night, but the world outside glistened, branches dripping, grass shining slickly in the grey light. Somehow it made the words heavier. Poor man, murmured Miss Pringle, dabbing at her eyes. He seemed so reliable. He seemed many things, said the Colonel stiffly, staring into his plate. Wilmot wasn't the sort to wander near a riverbank for the scenery. Tuppence rose from the table. Mrs. Havers, may we go into the village later? I think it only right to pay respects. Mrs. Havers hesitated, then nodded. If you must. The constable is at the riverside still. The river ran shallow and brown through the meadows, its surface broken by reeds and the occasional ripple of a drifting branch. A uniformed constable tipped his hat as the Beresfords approached. Tragic business, this, he said. Name's Wilmot, wasn't it? Found him wedged under the footbridge by the miller's field. Looks like he lost his footing in the dark. Tommy crouched to study the bank. The mud was churned where boots had slipped, but the water was no more than knee-deep. He drowned in this? He asked quietly. Could have hit his head, said the constable, or taken ill before he fell. The doctor will know more when the inquest's done. Tuppence's gaze drifted to the neat stack of the Major's effects on a canvas sheet, a walking stick, a pocketbook, and a pair of muddy shoes. She frowned. Those soles? Look, Tommy, that's clay, not river silt. He bent closer. The mud was darker, thicker. You're right. Clay like that's from higher ground. The constable looked mildly surprised. Beg pardon? Nothing, said Tommy smoothly. Old habit. Attention to detail. As they turned back up the path, Tuppence's expression was grim. He didn't drown here. Someone moved him. The village inn, the Golden Pike, was already buzzing with gossip by the time they arrived. Over steaming tea, Tommy listened while the landlord recounted what little he knew. Poor old Major. Kept to himself mostly, but there was talk he'd come back to see someone. No family, though. None that we ever saw. See someone? Asked Tuppence. Who? The landlord shrugged. Didn't say. Just that he'd once had business up at Widow's Lodge. Funny place, that. Folks say the walls still whisper. Back at the lodge, the house had sunk into a deeper silence. Mrs. Havers had withdrawn upstairs, leaving the guests to their own uneasy thoughts. Colonel Danvers stalked the corridor like a man keeping time with memory. Miss Pringle had retired early with a headache. Mr. Lee, the writer, sat in the corner of the drawing-room, tapping his pen against an empty page. "Writer's block?" Tommy asked lightly. Lee started, nearly spilling his ink. "Hardly. I was collecting impressions. Death has a curious effect on atmosphere, don't you think?" "Sometimes it clears it," said Tuppence. "Sometimes it thickens it." The young man coloured. "You think one of us knows more than we're saying?" Tuppence smiled without answering. Silence filled the space like fog. Later, in their room, Tommy lit a cigarette and stared out at the wet garden. "Wilmot once told me," he said slowly, "that loyalty is the last refuge of fools. It was his favourite saying." Tuppence nodded. "And fools apparently make good corpses." "Exactly. If Wilmot was mixed up in some old intelligence matter again, it may not have ended in 1945. People hold grudges longer than wars." She tapped her chin. "You saw the Colonel's face when Mrs. Havers mentioned the Major yesterday. There's bad blood there." "Possibly, but I'm more interested in who might have wanted Wilmot to arrive and disappear without fanfare." There was a knock at the door. It opened just enough to admit a timid face, the maid, a slight girl with anxious eyes and a cloth clutched in her hands. "Beg pardon, ma'am," she whispered. "I shouldn't speak out of turn, but you asked about strange goings-on." Tuppence gestured her in. "Go on." "It's the cellar key, ma'am. Went missing 3 days ago. Mrs. Havers keeps it locked always. Said it's where the old wine's kept. But it weren't on its hook last I cleaned." Tommy straightened. "And it hasn't been found?" The girl shook her head. "No, sir, but I heard footsteps down there last night, soft ones. Thought it might have been the Major." "Why would he be in the cellar?" Tuppence asked. "I don't know, ma'am, but I heard voices too. Only for a moment, mind. 2 of them." Her fingers twisted the cloth nervously. "Please, don't say I told you." "We won't," said Tuppence gently. "Thank you." When the girl had gone, Tommy stubbed out his cigarette. "Voices in the cellar, light in the attic. Our friends here seem to prefer after-hours conversations." "Perhaps," said Tuppence, "they're speaking to ghosts." The afternoon dwindled into a pale, uneasy dusk. In the hall the grandfather clock struck 5, and the air seemed to shiver with its tone. Tuppence paused before the guest register again, her gloved finger tracing the rewritten names. "Denham," she murmured. "Those are raised guests. Could Wilmot have come looking for them?" "Or for one of us pretending not to be them," said Tommy. They exchanged a long look, part understanding, part dread. Somewhere in the house a door closed softly. "Tomorrow," Tuppence said, her voice steady, "we find the cellar." Tommy nodded. "And if the widow's lodge has any ghosts left, we'll ask them ourselves." Outside, the rain began again, not heavy but persistent, tapping like deliberate fingers against the window panes. That evening the same dining room tried for charm, candles, polished wood, but every gleam felt too sharp and every shadow too deep. Candles flickering against polished wood, silver glinting in orderly rows, and the faint scent of lavender from a vase on the sideboard. But tonight, every gleam seemed a little too sharp, every shadow too deep. Dinner began with polite talk, weather, trains, and the unseasonable shortage of decent tea, yet beneath the veneer of civility, the air crackled like a live wire. Mrs. Havers presided at the head of the table, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly on the linen. To her right sat Colonel Danvers, carving the roast with the grim precision of a man still fighting imaginary battles. Opposite him, the Carltons whispered occasionally, too occasionally, Tuppence thought, as if guarding against the wrong word. Tommy, outwardly amiable, played host in spirit, if not in title, guiding conversation with the deftness of a man long trained in intelligence work. "So you all knew Major Wilmot, then?" he asked lightly. "He seems to have been quite the local figure." The Colonel's knife paused mid-cut. "Knew of him," he said curtly. "Our paths crossed during the war, of course. Fine officer, bit uncompromising." Miss Pringle cleared her throat nervously. I don't think I ever met him, though I remember his name. Something to do with communications, wasn't it?" Mr. Lee, the young writer, spoke for the first time that evening. "Intelligence, I believe. Signals, codes, that sort of thing. You know, All very hush-hush. Tuppence gave him an encouraging smile. Ah, codes. My husband and I dabbled in such things once upon a time. The Melford Intercept, for instance. That was a curious business, wasn't it? The effect was immediate. The Colonel's fork clattered against his plate. Mr. Lee started so violently he slopped wine across the tablecloth. Mrs. Havers's composure flickered, a fractional stiffening of the spine quickly mastered. "I beg your pardon," said Tuppence, her tone all apology. "Was I trespassing on classified ground?" "Hardly," muttered the Colonel. "Just unpleasant memories, best forgotten." "Quite," said Mrs. Havers smoothly. "We've all earned a little peace, haven't we?" The conversation limped back to safer territory, gardening, ration coupons, the price of petrol, but the harmony was broken. Tuppence had seen it before, the subtle recoil when truth brushed too close. As pudding arrived, Tommy leaned closer to her, murmuring under his breath. "That was deliberate." She smiled serenely. "Of course. And did you see? The Colonel and our writer both reacted like guilty schoolboys." He nodded. "The Melford Intercept. What was that again?" "An intelligence sting, 1944, she whispered. "A German operative in Britain sending coded messages through intercepted lines. Wilmot led the inquiry. The leak was never fully explained." "Until, perhaps tonight," Tommy murmured. When the last plates were cleared, Mrs. Havers suggested brandy in the sitting room. There the fire burned too brightly, the atmosphere both comfortable and strained. The guests arranged themselves as though in a tableau of domestic harmony. Colonel Danvers near the fire, Miss Pringle by the window, the Carltons close together on the settee, and Mr. Lee hovering uncertainly between them all. Tuppence drifted toward the piano, drawn by an old curiosity. A series of framed photographs decorated its top. Soldiers in uniform, a country wedding, a small silver frame turned face down. She lifted it slightly. "Don't touch that." The command came from Mrs. Havers, sharper than expected. For a moment, all conversation ceased. Tuppence set the frame gently back. "Forgive me." It looked as though it had fallen. Mrs. Havers recovered her poise with effort. "It hasn't fallen. Some memories are better left unlooked at." Her eyes moved briefly to the Colonel, then away again. Tommy crossed to the hearth, examining a brass coal scuttle. "You must have seen much of Major Wilmot, Mrs. Havers. He mentioned you often." "Not often," she said quietly. "He was kind to my late husband during the war, that was all." The Colonel's voice broke in, low and hard. "Wilmot was kind to no one. He was an investigator, made his career by pulling other men's apart." Miss Pringle gasped softly. "Surely you don't mean—" "I mean," said the Colonel, rising, "that loyalty was his weapon, and like all weapons it cuts both ways." He left the room abruptly. The silence he left behind was worse than his presence. Tuppence met Tommy's eyes across the fire. In that brief glance they both knew. The polite facade of Widow's Lodge was cracking. Later, when the others had drifted off to their rooms, Tuppence lingered by the dying fire. She reached absently for the poker, nudging at the embers. Something charred and irregular caught her eye. A corner of paper, half-burned, with the faint ghost of printed type. She used the poker to lift it clear and carried it to the lamplight. The fragment smelled faintly of ink and smoke. Only a few words were legible. Intercept confirmed. Subject, lion. The rest was scorched away. Tommy joined her, reading over her shoulder. Lion? Could that tie to the lion's paw on Wilmot's seal? Almost certainly. She slipped the fragment into her pocket. A telegram, I'd wager, burned to destroy evidence, but not quite thoroughly. He frowned. Why keep it in the fireplace of all places? Perhaps someone wanted it found by the right person. Upstairs the hallway was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. As they passed the Colonel's door, low voices drifted through, his and another man's, hushed and urgent. Tuppence caught a phrase. Never should have come back. Tommy put a finger to his lips. They waited until the conversation ended, the sound of footsteps receding toward the stairs' end. "Well," Tuppence murmured, "it seems Wilmot isn't the only ghost walking these halls." "Tomorrow," said Tommy, "we start asking questions in earnest." "Starting with Mrs. Havers," she said. "She knows more than she's telling, and perhaps she's not the only widow here." In her room, Tuppence opened the drawer of the small writing desk to tuck away the burned telegram. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper, left behind or misplaced. The ink was faded, the handwriting fine and deliberate. "The widow knows. Trust her, or none." She sat very still, listening to the faint creaks of the old house settling. Downstairs, the last of the embers winked out, and somewhere, far above, near the attic, a floorboard creaked as if under a stealthy step. Tommy Beresford was not a man given to rummaging through the personal belongings of the deceased. Still, there were exceptions, and Major Wilmot, lately found floating face down in the river, qualified splendidly. Mrs. Havers had allowed them to occupy the late Major's former room for convenience, her composure so practiced that Tommy suspected she preferred not to dwell upon its recent occupant. Tuppence was elsewhere, plying her conversational charm upon the widow herself. It left Tommy in charge of exploration, a task he approached with quiet efficiency and just enough guilt to feel human. He began with the desk. The drawers yielded an assortment of respectable relics: unpaid bills, a fountain pen, and a bottle of aspirin tablets, half empty. A sheaf of paper bore Wilmot's neat, angular hand, but most of the pages were blank except one. Across its top margin ran a list of meaningless symbols, cipher groups, Tommy noted, but below them, in faint pencil, the words, "Operation Lantern, Unfinished Business." He frowned. He remembered that code name from the war, though only in whispers. Operation Lantern had been one of those shadowy enterprises people pretended never happened, an operation meant to root out a double agent within British intelligence, someone who had passed coded transmissions to the enemy. Several good men had died before the mole disappeared into obscurity. "Lantern," Tommy murmured, and Wilmot was still chasing its ghost. He opened the wardrobe next. Behind a row of hanging coats he found a battered leather valise, its brass locks tarnished with age. The initials P.W. gleamed faintly. He unfastened the clasps, expecting the scent of mothballs and disappointment. Instead, he found a slim file bound with twine. The outer sheet bore the faded stamp, "Confidential, Defense Intelligence, 1944. The inside pages were water-damaged, the ink blurred, but Tommy could still decipher fragments. Intercepted messages, initials of agents, cryptic notations. The final page, more intact than the rest, contained only a single scrawled line: "The widow knows." He stared at it for a long moment, then closed the file carefully. When he reached for the valise again, the lamplight caught something on the inner lining. Faint scratches, deliberate rather than accidental. He bent closer, tracing them with a fingertip. Letters, crude but unmistakable. "The widow knows." The same phrase, etched by hand inside the case. "Well, Wilmot," he murmured, "you certainly didn't want anyone to miss the message." He slipped the file under his arm and left the room quietly. Downstairs, the house exhaled its habitual stillness. Somewhere beyond the parlour, a clock ticked with maddening precision. The faint murmur of voices guided him toward the drawing-room, where Tuppence was seated near the fire with Mrs. Havers. "Yes, of course I remember the war," Mrs. Havers was saying. "One doesn't forget that sort of thing." Her tone was perfectly calm, yet her hands, clasped on her lap, were rigid. Tuppence, who possessed the conversational instincts of a diplomat and the persistence of a bloodhound, smiled sympathetically. "You and your husband lived here, then?" "Here, yes," Mrs. Havers said, "though it was not a lodging house in those days. My husband was with the ministry." "Communications?" A faint tremor of hesitation. "In a manner of speaking." Tommy leaned quietly against the doorway, listening. "And your husband's death," Tuppence continued. "That was in 44, wasn't it? Around the time of that dreadful operation in Melford. What was it called? Operation Lantern?" The widow's poise faltered for the first time. Her chin lifted, but her eyes had lost their focus. "I prefer not to discuss it," she said, too quickly. "It was an accident." "I understand," Tuppence said gently. "It must be painful." Mrs. Havers drew a breath, regaining control. "Pain fades, Mrs. Beresford. Regret does not. And there are things in war one must learn to forgive oneself for, or one goes mad." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "Of course," said Tuppence softly. "Forgiveness is easier when one knows the truth." Mrs. Havers's eyes flicked toward her. "Sometimes truth serves no one." At that moment, Tommy entered deliberately, sparing his wife the task of pressing further. "My apologies for interrupting, ladies," he said lightly. "Mrs. Havers, your late guest's affairs have left a few papers behind. I thought it only proper to mention them." Her composure returned in an instant. "I appreciate your courtesy, Mr. Beresford. I'll arrange for their collection." Tommy inclined his head. "Of course, though some of them may be of official sensitivity." Her lips tightened. "I'm sure you'll exercise discretion." "I make a habit of it," he said. "But tell me, Mrs. Havers, does the phrase 'the widow knows' mean anything to you?" The word seemed to hang in the air like a struck note. Mrs. Havers' eyes widened imperceptibly before she rose. "Good evening, Mr. Beresford. I believe I shall retire." She left without another word. Tuppence looked up at him. "You didn't need to frighten her half to death." "She's already frightened," he said quietly. "Of whom? That's the question." They sat late into the evening in the small library, the only illumination a reading lamp that turned the air honey gold. Tuppence unfolded the document Tommy had brought down, her brows furrowing as she skimmed its damaged pages. "Operation Lantern," she murmured. "So this was Wilmot's obsession. Look here. Transmissions via domestic frequency. Local agent suspected. Identity withheld. And these initials, AD, they appear several times." "AD," Tommy repeated thoughtfully, "could be the Denhams whose names were scratched from the register. Could also stand for something else. Perhaps Agent Denham, or Alice Danvers. Colonel Danvers' daughter was called Alice, wasn't she? I overheard Mrs. Carlton mention it at breakfast." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You've been eavesdropping." "Observing," she corrected sweetly. "Besides, one learns more from gossip than from files." He leaned back, tapping his chin. "If Wilmot believed someone here was connected to Lantern, it explains his secrecy, and perhaps his death. But he left us no clear proof, only that phrase, 'the widow knows.'" Tuppence studied the line, then looked up. "Do you think it refers to Mrs. Havers herself?" "Possibly, but she's not behaving like a blackmailer or a spy. She's behaving like a woman haunted." "And yet," Tuppence said softly, "it was her husband who died during Lantern. If he was the traitor, perhaps she's carried the guilt all these years." Tommy nodded. "Or the knowledge, which may be worse." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both turned sharply. Tommy crossed to the door and opened it in time to glimpse a shadow retreating down the corridor. Slight, swift, feminine. A second later came the unmistakable clink of the back door latch. Tuppence stood beside him, pulling on her cardigan. "She's gone into the garden." They followed at a cautious distance. The night was crisp, faintly scented with damp leaves. The moon cast a narrow path of silver across the lawn, leading toward the overgrown greenhouse at the rear of the property. Mrs. Havers stood inside, her figure outlined against the glass, head bowed as though in prayer. When Tommy pushed open the door, she started violently. "Mr. Beresford, you frightened me." "I'm sorry," he said mildly. "Couldn't sleep. Neither could you, it seems." She pressed a hand to her throat. "It's the air here. It keeps one awake." Tuppence's tone was gentle but steady. "It isn't the air, is it? It's the past." For a long time the widow said nothing. Then she turned, her face pale in the moonlight. "Do you think I don't know what they called me? The widow, the one who stayed silent. They blamed my husband for that betrayal, but it wasn't him." "Then who?" asked Tommy. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know, only that Major Wilmot came to me years later. He said he'd uncovered the truth, that the real traitor was still alive, and that he would prove it." She looked toward the house, her eyes glistening. "He promised me peace, and now he's dead. That's my answer." Tuppence stepped closer. "Then you must help us find who silenced him." Mrs. Havers met her gaze. "Be careful, Mrs. Beresford. You're clever, but cleverness killed men like Wilmot. If you go on digging into Lantern, you may find it was never extinguished." She brushed past them, returning toward the lodge. Tommy watched her go. "She's either the key," he said softly, "or the lock itself." "And whichever she is," said Tuppence, "we're holding the match." It began with a whisper and a key. The whisper was Tuppence's, urgent but amused, as she leaned across the narrow bed toward Tommy. "If you're going to pretend to sleep through this, I shall go alone," she said. The key, and an old brass one purloined earlier from the maid's utility ring, glinted faintly in the candlelight. Tommy sighed with the weariness of a man long accustomed to midnight adventures. "You realize," he murmured, sitting up, "we are past the age for creeping through basements." "Speak for yourself," said Tuppence crisply, tying her dressing gown. "Mrs. Havers keeps that cellar locked for a reason, and it isn't vintage port. You heard what the maid said. Voices, missing keys, midnight visitors. It's the most excitement this house has had since blackout curtains." Tommy grinned despite himself. "Lead on, Matahari." They moved through the silent corridor, past the portraits that seemed to watch their trespass. Downstairs, the hall clock ticked with the smug rhythm of the righteous. The lamp over the stair was extinguished. Only the moonlight through the glass panes offered a dim path across the floor. The cellar door stood at the far end of the servants' passage, half hidden behind a coat rack and an umbrella stand. It was locked, as expected, but the key turned smoothly in the old iron latch. A cool draught rose from the stairwell, smelling of earth, dust, and something else, metallic, faintly electric. Tuppence paused at the threshold. "Doesn't that strike you as odd?" "What?" "That smell. Not damp, sharper, like burnt wiring." Tommy switched on his small torch, the beam cutting through the darkness. One way to find out. They descended slowly, the wooden steps creaking in complaint. The cellar was a warren of shadowy alcoves, rows of wine racks, old trunks, a bicycle leaning against a wall. Cobwebs shimmered like lace in the torchlight. Tuppence ran her hand along a shelf, brushing dust onto her sleeve. "I can't see any reason this should be kept locked, unless—" Her fingers paused on a section of the wine rack that felt oddly cool. "Tommy, shine the light here." The torch revealed a patch of brickwork darker than the rest, its mortar newer, less crumbled. The wine bottles before it were arranged neatly, too neatly. Tommy set down the torch and pressed against the rack experimentally. It shifted with a groan. "Help me with this." Together they eased it aside, revealing a narrow gap in the wall. Inside was a recess barely large enough for a small table. Upon it sat a metal transmitter, its surface dull with age, but the dials suspiciously clean. A set of headphones lay coiled beside it, and a thin wire led upward through the ceiling. "Well, well," murmured Tommy, "wireless communication in a respectable boarding house. How modern of them." Tuppence's eyes gleamed. Wilmot must have been using it to trace signals from the old network, or someone was using it after him. Tommy examined the dials. "Look here, the contacts are warm. This thing's been used, recently." He opened the battery tray. Inside, the ash of a spent cell still smouldered faintly. "Fresh," he said grimly. "Someone transmitted tonight." A faint sound interrupted him, the creak of a door above, the brush of a shoe on the upper stair. Tuppence's whisper was a breath. "Someone's coming." Tommy switched off the torch. They moved instinctively, backing into the coal bin near the corner. It was half full, and the dust rose in a suffocating cloud as they sank into it, pulling the lid down just enough to leave a slit of air. Footsteps descended, slow, measured, a man's tread. The cellar door closed softly. Through the slit, they could see a faint glow. The visitor carried a small lantern. He moved directly to the wine rack, sliding it aside with practiced ease. The light caught his hand, gloved, and then the bowl of a pipe. He struck a match, the flare illuminating a cloud of smoke. The scent drifted toward them, strong, aromatic tobacco. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a silent glance. None of the current guests smoked a pipe. The man knelt at the transmitter, adjusting the dials with sure familiarity. A low hum filled the air, the static pulse of a signal being tuned. He spoke softly, but his words were indistinct. Code phrases, half English, half something else. Then, just as quietly, he extinguished the lantern, replaced the rack, and ascended the stairs again. The door closed. For several seconds the cellar held only their breathing. Tuppence emerged first, brushing coal dust from her sleeve. "Pipe tobacco," she whispered. "Not Wilmot, not the Colonel, not the writer. None of them smoke." Tommy was already examining the transmitter again. He sent something brief, 10, perhaps 15 seconds. Morse from the rhythm. I caught part of it. L confirmed, A in danger. A could be Alice Danvers, said Tuppence quickly. The Colonel's daughter, or Mrs. Carlton before she married. Tommy nodded. And L might stand for lantern. Someone's warning someone else to her or confirming an order. He glanced at his watch. midnight. Whoever it was, he's gone to ground again. Then so should we, said Tuppence firmly, before Mrs. Havers catches us dusting her wine. They returned the rack to its place and slipped upstairs, locking the door behind them. But as they crossed the hall, a faint creak from the staircase above made them freeze. Mrs. Havers stood at the landing, her dressing gown drawn tightly, a candle in her hand. The flame threw strange shadows across her face. "Mr. Beresford," she said quietly. "Mrs. Beresford, may I ask why you are exploring my cellar at this hour?" Tuppence in an instant adopted her most charming air. "We couldn't sleep," she said lightly, "and Tommy thought a walk might help. We seem to have lost our way in your labyrinth of corridors." Mrs. Havers regarded them for a long moment. "The house can be confusing," she said finally, "especially at night, but I must insist you leave the lower floors to the staff. They're unsafe." Her eyes lingered on Tommy, cold and assessing. "Good night." She turned and vanished into her room, the candlelight winking out. Tommy exhaled softly. That, my dear, was the voice of someone who knows we weren't looking for exercise. Tuppence smiled faintly. And perhaps someone who knows more about what's under her house than she admits. Back in their room, Tuppence scrubbed coal dust from her hands at the washstand, while Tommy examined the scrap of coded notes they'd taken from the transmitter's shelf. The paper was brittle, but the ink still legible, a series of numbers and letters arranged in careful columns. 45, 19, M2, Tommy read aloud. Looks like coordinates, or perhaps cipher groups, nothing standard. Could Wilmot have been trying to trace the old lantern network? Possibly, or perhaps he stumbled upon someone else using it. The phrase L confirmed suggests lantern wasn't just a memory. It's active again. Tuppence sat on the edge of the bed, her expression thoughtful. That means one of our polite house guests is still communicating through wartime channels, nearly a decade later. Tommy folded the note and tucked it into his wallet. Then it's time to find which one of them smokes pipe tobacco and knows Morse code. The next morning brought no sign of unusual activity, but the house had acquired a new tension, the kind that lies just beneath ordinary conversation. The Colonel grumbled over breakfast about the quality of the bacon, Mrs. Carleton smiled too brightly, and Mrs. Havers' composure had regained its chill perfection. Tommy noticed a faint scent as he passed the Colonel's chair, shaving soap and aftershave, but no tobacco. Mr. Lee's fingers, however, bore faint yellow stains, though his cigarette case was conspicuously empty. Later, as they walked in the garden, Tuppence said quietly, "I checked the ashtray in the study. Someone's been smoking a pipe last night by the look of it. The ash was still warm." Tommy smiled grimly. "And Mrs. Havers says the cellar is unsafe. I think, my dear Tuppence, we've found the nerve centre of something very much alive." She nodded, eyes bright with excitement. Operation Lantern Reborn, and its ghosts refusing to rest. As they turned back toward the house, a curtain shifted in an upstairs window. A brief movement, gone as quickly as it appeared. Someone was watching them, and far below, in the quiet cellar, the transmitter's dial flickered once as though remembering its midnight secret. The clock in the drawing room struck 4, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to mark not just the hour, but the tension in the air. Tommy Beresford folded the Times and regarded his wife across the tea table with an expression of mild anticipation. "Well," he said, "if one can't fish for truth, one might as well cast a line of deceit." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You mean, of course, the Colonel." "Exactly. Wilmot's dead, someone's sending midnight messages, and Colonel Danvers looks like a man who's seen a ghost he once helped bury. A fabricated message might jog his conscience." She poured his tea. "You'll never make a proper liar, Tommy. You still blush when you mispronounce a French menu." "Then it's a good thing I've got you to keep me convincing," he said lightly. They found Colonel Danvers in the morning room, pacing before the window with military impatience. The light fell harshly across his face, revealing the deep creases of a man who had given orders too long and regretted too many. "Colonel," said Tommy pleasantly, "forgive the intrusion. I wanted to deliver a note from Major Wilmot." The Colonel stopped short. "From Wilmot?" "Yes, before his unfortunate accident. He asked us to see you should anything happen." Danvers's colour drained a shade. What sort of note? Tommy produced a folded sheet from his pocket. The handwriting was Wilmot's, or close enough. Tuppence had forged it neatly using the scraps they'd found in his room. Danvers. Lantern unfinished. The time for silence is over. P.W. The colonel read it twice, then sat down heavily. Good God, he muttered. So he meant to go through with it. Go through with what, Colonel? Asked Tuppence, her tone all innocent curiosity. He looked up sharply, then seemed to deflate. You wouldn't understand. It's old business. Best forgotten. Forgotten, perhaps, said Tommy, but not forgiven. Danvers' eyes snapped. That's easy to say when you weren't there. You can't imagine what it was like in those final months. Every message a potential betrayal, every friend a possible spy. Wilmot, he was obsessed with finding the traitor. I warned him to let it go. Tuppence leaned forward. But you were stationed here, weren't you? In Melford-on-Lee? He hesitated. Yes. Lantern's communications base was nearby. My unit handled field security. And Wilmot accused you, Tommy said softly. Danvers's hands tightened on his knees. Of negligence, not treason. He believed I'd missed a clue, that my delay cost 2 agents their lives. Perhaps he was right, but I wasn't the traitor. I was merely tired. Men break differently. There was a silence. Tuppence regarded him thoughtfully, her tone gentle. You and Wilmot never reconciled? He wrote to me once after the war, said he'd uncovered new evidence, wanted me to return to Melford. I refused. There's only so much penance a man can pay. His gaze shifted toward the window, and in that instant his expression changed. Tuppence followed his line of sight. In the garden below, Mrs. Carleton stood talking to her husband, her head tilted back, sunlight catching her hair. When she laughed, a sound like glass on stone, the colonel flinched almost imperceptibly. Tommy noticed. You know her, don't you? Danvers's mouth tightened. She's familiar. Her father was in my regiment. Was? Died in France, 44. Brave man. He rose abruptly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've a letter to write. He strode out, leaving behind the faint scent of cigar smoke and something heavier, remorse. Tuppence waited until the sound of his steps had faded before she spoke. He's lying, Tommy. About what? About how well he knows Mrs. Carleton. That wasn't the look of an old acquaintance, that was the look of a man seeing his past, in flesh and blood. Tommy nodded slowly. And if her father really was in his regiment, or worse, under his command, that would tie her to Operation Lantern. And explain why she's so brittle, Tuppence added. She laughs too easily for someone at ease. Tommy smiled faintly. Darling, you've described half the women in Mayfair. She ignored that. We need proof, something tangible linking them. That afternoon, while the house dozed through its habitual lull, Tuppence slipped into the colonel's room. It smelled faintly of bay rum and polish, the scent of discipline. The desk drawers were locked, but she'd come prepared with a small hairpin. Years of experience had made her deft. The top drawer yielded nothing but correspondence, pension letters, old regimental papers. The second contained a stack of photographs. She flipped through them, officers in uniform, camp scenes, a formal group portrait labelled Melford Command, 1944. And then she froze. A smaller photograph lay between 2 sheets of paper. A young woman in an army signals uniform smiling shyly at the camera. The face was unmistakable, Mrs. Carleton, except the photo was dated 1944, and the caption on the back in a masculine hand read, Alice Denham. Denham, the erased name in the guest register. Tuppence exhaled softly. So, our charming Mrs. Carleton is really Alice Denham, and she's been here before. A floorboard creaked in the corridor. She replaced the photo swiftly and closed the drawer just as a shadow appeared under the door. Mrs. Beresford? The voice was polite, neutral. Mrs. Havers. Tuppence opened the door, feigning nonchalance. Just looking for a book, Mrs. Havers. The colonel mentioned having a volume on field ciphers. Mrs. Havers smiled faintly. Curiosity is an admirable trait, Mrs. Beresford, so long as it doesn't stray into trespass. Her eyes lingered for a fraction too long before she moved away. That evening, the dinner table was a play of masks. Colonel Danvers spoke little. Mrs. Carlton avoided his gaze entirely. Her husband prattled about a new car, oblivious. At one point, Tuppence dropped her napkin. When she stooped to retrieve it, she caught sight of the Colonel's hand beneath the table, motionless beside his wineglass. Mrs. Carlton's hand, equally still, rested just a few inches away. They were not touching, but the space between them thrummed with unspoken tension. Later, in the drawing room, Tommy stoked the fire while conversation drifted toward music and memory. Tuppence played idly with the radio dial, then glanced at the Colonel. "Did you ever use one of these during the war?" He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "These transmitters. I imagine you must have relied on them heavily during Lantern." His expression closed like a door. "I've no desire to discuss that business." Mrs. Carlton spoke suddenly. "Nor do I." The room fell silent. Her husband laughed uncertainly. "My dear, whatever is the matter?" "Nothing," she said too quickly. "Just tired." She rose and left the room. The Colonel followed not long after. Tommy and Tuppence waited until the others had dispersed. "She's cracking," Tuppence murmured, "and so is he. I'd wager they share more than history, perhaps guilt." Tommy nodded. If Wilmot was closing in on the truth, they might both have something to lose. He stared into the fire. "Do you think Danvers could have been the double agent after all?" "Possibly. But if he was, then why risk inviting his accomplice here? Unless—" Tuppence's eyes brightened. "Unless she's not his accomplice, but his punishment." "How do you mean?" "She could be here under another's orders, perhaps Wilmot's, to remind him what he cost, or to finish what Wilmot began." Tommy gave a low whistle. "That's rather grim, even for you." "And yet," she said softly, "it fits. He sees her and remembers everything. She sees him and remembers her father's death. One accuses, the other denies, and somewhere between them lies the truth." The grandfather clock struck midnight as they climbed the stairs. Outside, the house settled into uneasy sleep. Through the open landing window drifted the faint scent of pipe smoke, sweet, aromatic, unmistakable. Tuppence turned sharply toward the corridor, but it was empty. "Tommy," she whispered, "he's not the only one awake tonight." From below, a floorboard creaked, and somewhere in the darkness, two figures met, one carrying guilt, the other carrying purpose. The sound of the motorcar broke the calm of Widow's Lodge like a pebble tossed into still water. The guests, gathered for their late morning tea, looked up as tires crunched over gravel. Mrs. Havers set down her teapot, her composure flickering for a fraction of a second. "We are not expecting anyone," she said quietly. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a glance. Unannounced visitors seldom brought peace. Moments later, the front doorbell rang, a bright, confident peal, as though rung by someone accustomed to welcome rather than suspicion. Mrs. Havers answered it herself. The man on the doorstep was tall, immaculately dressed, with a genial smile and the kind of eyes that had learned to look interested without ever revealing their own thoughts. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat with a flourish. "I'm afraid I arrive uninvited. My name is Peregrine, Geoffrey Peregrine. I believe you are acquainted with my old friend, Major Wilmot." The mention of Wilmot's name hung in the air like a draught. Mrs. Havers hesitated. "Indeed. You are most welcome, of course, though I regret to say, Major Wilmot—" "I know," said Peregrine gravely. "I saw the report in the Times, a tragic end for a fine man, but I thought, perhaps, there might be papers, unfinished business of his, you understand. I was one of his associates during the war." Tuppence's ears pricked up. "Intelligence work?" He smiled with just enough humility to seem sincere. "In a modest capacity. Wilmot and I shared a posting near Melford during the Lantern operation." That was enough to secure him a seat at the luncheon table and the collective curiosity of every guest. Peregrine charmed easily. Over lunch he told stories of the war years, half humorous, half heroic, deftly edited to flatter his own discretion. The Colonel regarded him with wary civility. Mrs. Carlton listened too closely, and Mrs. Havers kept glancing toward the door, as though hoping he would vanish as abruptly as he'd appeared. "Major Wilmot spoke of you often," Peregrine said at last, directing the line toward Tuppence. "He admired your knack for noticing what others missed." Tuppence smiled. "That sounds like Wilmot. He never could resist flattery when he meant to enlist help." "Ah," Peregrine's tone turned playful. "Then perhaps you'll forgive me for asking. Do you know whether he left any papers? Anything marked Operation Lantern, perhaps? Tommy's spoon paused mid-air. And why should that interest you? Peregrine blinked innocently. Professional curiosity. History fascinates me, especially the parts written in invisible ink. His charm was disarming, but Tommy saw the calculation beneath it. When lunch ended, Peregrine requested to see Wilmot's room, claiming he wished to pay respects to an old comrade. Mrs. Havers, with brittle politeness, led him upstairs. As soon as the door closed behind them, Tuppence whispered, "He's too smooth and too well informed. I don't like it." "Nor do I," said Tommy. "He knows Lantern wasn't public business. That makes him either friend or ghost from the same graveyard." An hour later, Tuppence took it upon herself to deliver a tray of tea to the study. She found Peregrine alone, crouched beside Wilmot's suitcase, rifling through the contents with the air of a man searching for confirmation rather than discovery. When he saw her in the doorway, he didn't startle. He simply straightened and smiled. "Caught in the act," he said lightly. "You must think me the most dreadful cad." "Only mildly dreadful," Tuppence replied. "I can't imagine what you hope to find in a dead man's belongings." "Answers," he said, the levity slipping. "Wilmot was close to something before he died. He wrote to me, the week before it happened, said the widow still held the key." "The widow?" He nodded. "A code name. Lantern used it during the war. I thought perhaps he meant a person, but it could as easily have been a place." Tuppence met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps it means both." His smile returned, thinner now. "You're sharp, Mrs. Beresford. I see why he trusted you." "Then you'll forgive me," she said sweetly, "if I don't return the favour." He laughed, not entirely convincingly, and left the room humming under his breath. Tuppence knelt beside the suitcase. He'd left the papers in perfect order, but when she lifted the bottom lining, she found a faint smudge of tobacco ash, pipe tobacco. That evening brought rain at last, fine, silvery drops whispering against the windows. The house gathered for supper, but Peregrine was absent. "Gone for a walk, I believe," said Mrs. Havers tersely, "though what he hopes to see in this weather, I cannot imagine." The Colonel grunted. "Men like Peregrine see what others prefer to miss. I'd wager he's sniffing for Wilmot's ghost." Miss Pringle shivered. "Oh, do stop. This house has enough ghosts already." When the meal ended, Tommy stirred the fire and lit a cigarette before joining Tuppence. "I think our visitor knows about the transmitter," he said quietly. "He arrived too soon after the last message. Coincidence doesn't stretch that far." Tuppence nodded. If he's the man behind the signal, what was he sending, and to whom? Before Tommy could answer, a shrill cry cut through the hall. Mrs. Havers stood at the open French doors, her hand at her mouth. "In the garden," she gasped. "There's a man. He's hurt." They hurried outside. The rain had eased, but the grass was slick and gleaming under the lanterns. Near the sundial, half concealed by shrubbery, lay Peregrine, motionless, face pale, one hand clutching at the gravel. Tommy knelt beside him. "Alive," he said after a moment. "Unconscious, but alive." Tuppence examined the ground. No sign of struggle, just a fall, or a push. Mrs. Havers wrung her hands. "He must have slipped." "Perhaps," said Tommy, though most men don't slip with the back of their head neatly bruised. He searched Peregrine's coat for identification. From one pocket he drew a crumpled note, the ink blurred by damp, but the words still legible. "The widow still guards the secret." Tuppence exhaled sharply. "He told me the same phrase hours ago. Why carry it, unless he meant to show it to someone?" Tommy looked toward the house. In the upper windows, faint lights glowed, the Colonel pacing his room, Mrs. Carleton's curtain twitching, the maid's shadow crossing the landing. Someone here knew he'd found something, and they silenced him before he could share it. Mrs. Havers, recovering her composure, gestured toward the steps. "Help me bring him inside. He'll catch his death out here." Together they lifted the man, half-conscious, into the hall. His head lolled against Tommy's shoulder, his breath shallow but steady. "Best get the doctor," Tuppence said. "No telephone service tonight," Mrs. Havers murmured. "The lines are down." Tommy's gaze sharpened. Convenient timing. Half an hour later, Peregrine lay in the drawing-room, wrapped in blankets before the fire. A bruise darkened the back of his skull. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused. "Wilmot," he murmured. "She still knows." Then he sank again into unconsciousness. Tuppence stood beside him, thoughtful. He's either victim or bait. Tommy nodded slowly. And either way, someone thought he'd said too much. From the corner, Mrs. Havers watched silently. Her hands, folded neatly before her, trembled once. When the clock struck 9, the power flickered. Shadows leapt across the walls, long, distorted, alive with suggestion. Tuppence's voice was soft but certain. The widow's secret didn't die with Wilmot. It's alive in this house, and now it's guarding itself. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming like whispered code upon the glass. The morning after Peregrine's mysterious accident dawned in uneasy quiet. No one spoke much over breakfast. Even the clatter of cutlery seemed to echo too loudly in the dining room. Mrs. Havers presided as usual, but her face was drawn, her smile taut. Outside, the lawns glistened with dew. Inside, something darker hung over Widow's Lodge. Not grief exactly, but expectation. Tuppence sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "She knows we're watching," she murmured to Tommy. Tommy, glancing discreetly at Mrs. Havers, nodded. "And I'd say she's weighing what to tell and what to bury with Wilmot." "Then we'll make it easier for her," Tuppence said, setting down her cup. "Sometimes a secret just needs permission to breathe." They found Mrs. Havers later that morning in the drawing-room, standing by the piano with one hand resting lightly on the turned-down wedding photograph. The fire had burned low. The light from the window was soft, forgiving. "Mrs. Havers," Tuppence said gently, "may we have a word?" The widow turned, calm but resigned, as though she had expected this moment. "Of course, Mrs. Beresford. I imagine you have questions." Tommy inclined his head. "Only one to begin with. Major Wilmot trusted you. Deeply, it seems. But he also left behind too many half-truths. We'd like to hear yours." For a long time, Mrs. Havers said nothing. Then, with the faintest sigh, she sat. "I suppose I've been waiting to tell it," she murmured, "though God knows, not to strangers." Tuppence took the seat opposite, her manner kind but firm. "We're not strangers to what silence costs." A small smile flickered across Mrs. Havers' lips, the smile of a woman long past sentiment. "Very well," she said. "You know about Operation Lantern?" "Yes," said Tommy, "enough to recognize its ghosts." "Then you know it was an intelligence sting, a web of signals and half-truths, set up to catch a German operative working inside British command. My husband, Arthur Havers, was stationed at Melford-on-Lee. He was charming, ambitious, and careless. He began to drink, to talk, to think himself indispensable." Her voice grew quieter. "Wilmot trusted him, too much. They'd served together since North Africa. But Arthur passed information, codes, safe routes, agent names, for money at first, then out of pride, I think. He told himself he was manipulating the enemy for Britain's sake, but he wasn't. He was just playing both sides." Tuppence said softly, "You discovered it." Mrs. Havers nodded. "I found the messages, hidden under the floorboards of our quarters. I confronted him. He laughed, said Wilmot would never believe me. He was right. Wilmot idolized him. So I went to Wilmot myself. I told him everything." Her eyes clouded. "He didn't laugh then. He acted. He sent a counter-signal, a trap to expose the chain. The operation succeeded, but Arthur was caught in it. The enemy turned on him. He was shot trying to cross into Belgium." Tommy said quietly, "You saved lives." "I destroyed one," she replied simply. "And Wilmot promised me no one would ever know. He called me the widow, the only name he used in his files. After the war he came here once or twice, to see that I was comfortable, he said. But every time I saw him, I saw Arthur dying again. The debt between us was too heavy to speak of." She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "And then, a year ago, someone wrote to me, an unsigned note. I know who the widow is. Pay, or your secret becomes history." Tuppence's voice softened. "And you paid?" "At first. Then I stopped. The letters changed, darker, angrier. 'The widow guards lies as deadly as her husband's,' they said. I thought Wilmot had betrayed me after all, but he hadn't. He wrote last month, said he'd traced the blackmailer, that it was connected to Lantern. He asked me to trust him one last time, and then he died." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. "Mrs. Havers, there's something else. In your drawer, a letter signed A.D. Do you know who that might be?" The widow's composure faltered. "Yes," she whispered. "Alice Denham. She was one of Wilmot's signal officers. Brilliant, ambitious, and close to him. Too close. I suspected she knew my husband's weakness before I did." "Alice Denham," Tuppence repeated thoughtfully. "Then Mrs. Carleton." Mrs. Havers closed her eyes. "Yes, that's her. She married after the war. Changed her name, perhaps her conscience. I never thought I'd see her again, not until she arrived here last week. When she looked at me, I knew she hadn't forgotten, or forgiven." Tommy said grimly, "And Wilmot's last note, the widow knows, might have been meant for her as much as for you." Mrs. Havers pressed a hand to her forehead. "You think she's the blackmailer?" Tuppence hesitated. "If she knew about Lantern, if she knew your role, she had motive to punish you. But blackmail requires fear, not justice." The widow's voice dropped. "Perhaps it's both. She lost her father because of my husband's betrayal. I can't say she'd be wrong to hate me." A silence fell, the heavy human kind that fills a room with unspoken forgiveness and impossible repair. A log in the hearth cracked softly. The scent of burnt oak filled the room. Mrs. Havers rose and crossed to a small chest beneath the window. From within it, she drew a packet of letters bound with faded blue ribbon. "He wrote to me from the front," she said. "Arthur. I kept them all. I couldn't bear to destroy them, though every word cuts." Tuppence took the top letter. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting neat but strained. She read aloud, "My dearest Nora, the code changes tomorrow. Wilmot suspects. If I fail, tell them I was trying to protect you. A." She folded it carefully. "You see," Mrs. Havers whispered, "he didn't betray for ideology, only to save himself and me. That's the curse of it, Mrs. Beresford. Even love can rot when buried too long." Tommy said gently, "And now the secret's festering again. Someone's using your guilt as a weapon." Mrs. Havers nodded slowly. "I thought confessing might stop it. But if Alice truly is behind this, she'll not rest until I'm ruined." Tuppence placed a hand over hers. "Not if we can help it. The truth's a cleaner thing in daylight, even when it hurts." That afternoon, Tommy went to check on Peregrine, still unconscious but stable. Tuppence remained with Mrs. Havers, helping her sort through the letters, searching for anything connecting to A.D. After nearly an hour, Tuppence lifted the last envelope and gasped. The signature was familiar, but the ink fresher than the rest. The letter was dated only a month earlier. "My dear Nora, I know you tried to warn Wilmot. I know you told him what I did. I bear no ill will. But silence can't last forever. The truth must surface, and when it does, you'll understand why I returned to Melford. A.D." Tuppence read it twice. "She admits it," she said softly. "But not guilt, only purpose. Whatever Mrs. Carleton came here to do, it isn't blackmail alone. She's finishing what Wilmot began." When she showed the letter to Mrs. Havers, the widow's face paled. "Then it's begun again. The reckoning." "Not if we intercept it first," Tuppence said firmly. "But you must stay here tonight. Promise me you won't go wandering." Mrs. Havers gave a sad little smile. "You sound like my son." "I doubt he was this bossy," said Tuppence, and managed to make her laugh. A small, brittle sound, but genuine. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the elms, Tuppence stood by the window, watching the first lamps flicker on across the village. Tommy joined her, his expression grave. "She's told us everything," he said. "And now we have the final link, Alice Denham. If she's A.D., then Wilmot's note, Peregrine's visit, and the blackmail all point to her." "But what if she's not the villain?" said Tuppence softly, "but the avenger? What if Wilmot died trying to stop her, not protect her?" Tommy frowned. "Either way, we're closing in, and that means whoever's still hiding the rest of Lantern's truth won't wait quietly." Tuppence looked back toward the closed door where Mrs. Havers rested by the fire. Poor woman. All she did was tell the truth, and it's been eating her alive ever since. Tommy slipped an arm around her shoulders. "Secrets have long appetites, my dear. They never stop feeding." Downstairs, the clock ticked solemnly toward 8. The house was hushed once more. In Mrs. Havers' room, the fire burned low, shadows dancing across her tired face. She gazed at the photograph on the piano. now turned upright again. For the first time in years, she whispered her husband's name aloud, and somewhere beyond the walls of Widow's Lodge a faint crackle of static stirred, as though the transmitter below were waking once more to the call of the past. By late afternoon, the telephone lines were repaired. Tommy rang the yard discreetly, and an inspector waited down the lane for their signal. It began, fittingly, with a whisper in the dark. "Are you certain this will work?" Tuppence murmured, her voice barely audible above the faint hum of the attic's ancient rafters. Tommy, crouched beside the transmitter they had painstakingly reconstructed, adjusted a dial with a practiced hand. "As certain as one can be when fishing for murderers with bait made of lies," he said. "If she's still listening, she'll come." The attic smelled of dust and history, old wood, moth-eaten curtains, the faint metallic tang of forgotten machinery. Moonlight filtered through a small round window, laying silver across the transmitter's dials like cold fire. On the table beside them lay the typed message Tuppence had prepared. Lan 1, evidence located, Widow's Lodge, lantern files buried beneath floorboards. Trust no one. It was perfect, just enough truth to tempt a guilty conscience. Tommy glanced at his watch. She'll move within the hour if she means to. Guilt doesn't sleep. And if it's not her? He gave her a wry look. Then we owe Mrs. Havers an apology and Scotland Yard a confusing phone call. They exchanged a small, grim smile, the sort of humour that grows only in the company of long experience and shared danger. By midnight, the house had settled into uneasy silence. Downstairs, Mrs. Havers dozed fitfully before the fire. The Colonel's door was closed. Peregrine still slept under watch in the study. In the attic, the transmitter sat idle but charged. Tommy and Tuppence had hidden themselves behind an old steamer trunk near the eaves, leaving the lamp low and the door slightly ajar. The weight stretched, each minute heavy with suspense. Tuppence could hear her own heartbeat, could count the faint creaks of the beams as the house shifted in its sleep. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. A figure ascending the narrow attic stair. Tuppence's hand found Tommy's in the dark. The latch turned. Mrs. Carleton entered. She wore a dark travelling coat and carried a small lantern. Her face was pale, her expression grimly resolute. She crossed to the transmitter with the air of one completing a long-delayed duty. Tommy tensed beside Tuppence, but she caught his sleeve. "Wait." Mrs. Carleton lit the lantern and set it down. The warm glow threw her shadow across the wall, slender, trembling. From her coat pocket she drew a folded paper, smoothing it on the table. Then she began to work the dials, her movements precise, practiced. The faint buzz of the transmitter filled the attic. Tommy stepped forward. "Careful, Mrs. Carleton," he said quietly. "That frequency is rather crowded tonight." She spun round, the lantern flame quivering. For a moment her composure cracked, then she straightened, chin high. "Mr. Beresford, you're trespassing." "And you," said Tuppence softly, stepping from the shadows, "are broadcasting to ghosts." Mrs. Carleton's gaze flicked between them, and then to the transmitter. "So it was a trap," she said bitterly. "Wilmot taught you well." Tommy shook his head. "No, Mrs. Carleton. Wilmot's dead because he still believed in honour among spies. We only set the bait. You took it." Her mouth trembled. "He betrayed me first." Tuppence's voice was gentle. "You mean he betrayed your father?" The woman's hands clenched. "You've read the files, then?" "We've read enough," said Tuppence. "Alice Denham, daughter of Captain Charles Denham, executed in 1944 after Operation Lantern collapsed. Your initials, A.D., were on Wilmot's last note." For a moment the name seemed to strip away her poise. "He let my father die," she whispered. "He knew the leak came from Arthur Havers, the widow's husband, but he concealed it to protect her. My father was accused instead, shot as a traitor. They called it justice. I called it murder." Tommy said quietly, "And so you found Wilmot?" "Yes," she said fiercely. "I tracked him for years. I thought he'd confess, that he'd clear my father's name. But he refused. Said the truth would destroy too many. That was his answer to everything. Protect the living, forget the dead." Tuppence's eyes softened. "So you killed him?" There was no denial, only a terrible calm. "He came to Widow's Lodge to confront her, the widow. He said he would tell the truth at last, but I knew what that meant. He'd absolve her, bury it all again. I met him by the river. He said he pitied me. Pity! Her voice broke, trembling with years of bitterness. He turned away, and I pushed him. Just one shove. He fell, struck his head. The current did the rest. I didn't mean... She stopped herself, covering her mouth as if she could shove the words back inside. You meant to end the silence, Tuppence said quietly. And you did. But the truth has its own price. Mrs. Carleton turned on her, eyes bright with desperate pride. And what price would you pay, Mrs. Beresford, to right a wrong like that? To see your father's name cleared after 30 years of shame? I did what I had to do. Tommy stepped forward. And now you mean to finish it? That transmitter wasn't calling for help. It was sending the last piece of Lantern's code. You've been feeding information, haven't you? Not to Germany this time, but to every journalist, every rival agency still digging for ghosts. She gave a short, humourless laugh. You think small, Mr. Beresford. Truth is the most dangerous intelligence of all. Once the story breaks, no one will be innocent again. Not the army, not the state, not the comfortable widows who buried their sins under charity. Her voice wavered. You should understand. You've both lived on secrets long enough. Tommy's tone was almost kind. The difference, Mrs. Carleton, is that ours never killed anyone. The sound of a door opening below interrupted them. Footsteps echoed faintly up the stairs, firm, deliberate. Mrs. Carleton's composure cracked. No, she whispered. Not him. Colonel Danvers appeared in the doorway, his face drawn, his expression both resolute and broken. Alice, he said quietly. It's over. She recoiled. You shouldn't be here. I should have been years ago, he said. When your father died, I swore I'd keep watch over you. But I failed then, and I failed again when I saw you here, and said nothing. She stared at him, stunned. You knew? I suspected, he said heavily. Wilmot told me enough. I tried to keep you away from this place, from her. But when I realized what you'd done, he faltered, voice thick. I couldn't decide whether to protect you or turn you in. She looked at him with something between fury and grief. You loved my mother once. Did you love her enough to let her name be blackened too, or only enough to pity her daughter? He stepped closer. I loved you, Alice. God help me, I still do. The words hung in the still air, fragile as glass. Tuppence's voice broke the silence. Colonel, we've already sent for the police. It's over. The best thing you can do now is see that she surrenders safely. Mrs. Carleton's eyes flashed. Surrender? For what? For telling the truth? You think I care about prison? She turned toward the transmitter, fumbling for the switch. Once the final signal is sent, the whole story will come out. Everything, Wilmot, Havers, all of them covered up. Tommy was faster. He crossed the space in 2 strides, pulling the plug free. The machine died with a sputter of static. For a moment, there was only breathing, hers sharp and ragged, his steady but grim. Then the sound of footsteps again, heavier this time, official. A voice called up the stairs. Beresford, Scotland Yard, you rang? Tommy exhaled slowly. Right on cue. Alice turned toward the colonel, eyes shining with a strange, defeated tenderness. You should have let me do it, she whispered. At least then it would have meant something. He took her hand gently. It already does, just not in the way you think. When they led her down the stairs a few minutes later, she didn't resist. The lantern light trembled across her face, proud, exhausted, almost serene. Mrs. Havers stood waiting at the bottom of the staircase, one hand clutching the banister as if it were all that kept her upright. Their eyes met briefly, 2 women bound by the same tragedy, divided only by how they carried it. As the constables escorted Mrs. Carleton to the car, Tuppence turned to Mrs. Havers. She thought she was avenging him, she said softly. Mrs. Havers nodded, and perhaps she was, but vengeance doesn't mend the past. It only teaches it to walk again. Later, when the house was quiet once more, Tommy and Tuppence returned to the attic. The transmitter sat cold and lifeless, the false message still on the table. Tommy regarded it for a long time. Funny thing, he said. We spent a war building secrets and another lifetime untangling them. You'd think truth would come cheaper by now. Tuppence smiled sadly. Truth's never cheap, Tommy. Only paid for in different currencies. She reached out and turned off the lantern. The light died slowly, leaving only the moon to silver the floorboards, pale, distant, unjudging. Together they descended the stairs, their footsteps soft in the sleeping house. Behind them, Widow's Lodge fell silent at last, its secrets finally spoken, its ghosts at rest. Dawn came hesitantly to Widow's Lodge, spilling a pale wash of light across the worn oak floors and the faded floral curtains. The house, which only a night ago had seemed swollen with secrets and whispers, now felt curiously hollow, as though it had exhaled at last. Tommy stood by the drawing-room window, watching the early mist lift from the garden. The police car had gone an hour before, the colonel with it, grave and silent. A few constables lingered outside to finish their reports, boots damp with dew, their voices low and practical, all the mundane business that follows tragedy. Behind him, the sound of porcelain and silver marked Tuppence's quiet industry as she arranged what passed for breakfast: lukewarm tea, a heel of bread, and a brave attempt at marmalade. "Well," she said at last, "that's that. Widow's Lodge is clean again, of bodies at least." Tommy turned from the window, a ghost of a smile touching his face. "You make it sound like spring cleaning, though I dare say this sort leaves more dust than it removes." She came to stand beside him, following his gaze out toward the drive. The gravel glistened faintly, still dark where last night's rain had soaked it. A gardener's wheelbarrow lay tipped over near the hedge, as though abandoned mid-task years ago. Everything about the scene seemed weary, not ruined, simply used up. From upstairs came the faint sound of a suitcase clasp snapping shut. Mrs. Havers descended a few minutes later, dressed in a neat travelling suit of navy blue. Her face was pale but composed. She paused in the hall, looking around the room as one might look at an old photograph, tenderly, but without nostalgia. "Going so soon?" Tuppence asked gently. "Yes." The widow's voice was soft but steady. "The inspector said I was free to leave. There's nothing for me here now." She hesitated, then added with a wry smile, "I'm not sure there ever was. Just ghosts I kept entertaining out of habit." Tommy stepped forward. "Where will you go?" She considered the question. "Perhaps to my sister's in Devon. She has a cottage near the sea. I think I'd like to remember the sound of waves instead of telegraph wires." There was a small silence, filled with the faint ticking of the clock. "You did the right thing," Tuppence said quietly. Mrs. Havers looked at her. "I told the truth, if that's what you mean. But truth doesn't always behave like a blessing, Mrs. Beresford. Sometimes it lingers like smoke." Tuppence nodded. "Still, better to open the window." The widow smiled faintly, then extended her hand to Tommy. "Major Wilmot trusted you both," she said. "I see now he had reason." When she was gone, her taxi shrinking to a small blur along the village lane, the house felt emptier than ever, its silence no longer secretive, merely sad. By mid-morning, the guests had begun to drift away. Miss Pringle left first, clutching a Bible and muttering about restless spirits. The Carltons' car arrived next. The husband drove, face stony, the passenger seat conspicuously empty. Mrs. Carlton's things had already been taken away as evidence, but her absence hung over the house like a shadow that refused to fade. Even Mr. Lee, the writer, vanished discreetly after breakfast, leaving only a scrawled note of apology. "For research purposes only. My next book owes you both a dedication." Tuppence read it aloud, arching an eyebrow. "Do you suppose that counts as gratitude or cheek?" Tommy chuckled. "A bit of both, I should think. Writers live on borrowed emotions. It's cheaper than buying their own." When the last car had gone, they wandered once more through the empty rooms. The air was lighter now, dust motes swirling in the sunbeams, footsteps echoing softly. The piano in the drawing-room stood open, a single sheet of music still propped upon it. Tuppence brushed her fingers along the keys, producing a hesitant chord that sounded both wrong and right. "Strange," she murmured, "how a place that held so much deceit can look so ordinary in daylight." "That's betrayal for you," said Tommy. "It always begins looking ordinary. Loyalty to the wrong cause, belief in the wrong person. It's a comfortable lie until the bill comes due." She turned to look at him, her expression softer. "You sound positively philosophical." "I'm getting old," he said. "Age gives one the right to moralize over cold tea." She laughed lightly. "You'll be moralizing over burnt toast next." "Not if you're cooking it," he said gallantly. Then, after a pause, "Tuppence, do you ever wonder if we've spent too long chasing ghosts?" "Only when we catch them," she replied. "Then I remember why we started, because someone has to." She crossed to the window where the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze. "Besides," she added, "you rather like the ghosts. They make you feel useful." Tommy grinned. "And you like proving them wrong." "Exactly." By noon they had packed their things. The inspector's men had finished their notes and cleared the last of their equipment. Widow's Lodge was left to its stillness once more, a hollow echo of laughter and regret. Outside, the air was brisk and bright. The Beresfords' little motorcar waited in the drive, sunlight glinting on its bonnet. As they climbed in, the village seemed already to be returning to its ordinary rhythms. A milk cart rattled past. A dog barked somewhere down the lane. Just as Tommy started the engine, a familiar figure came hurrying toward them. Miss Postlethwaite, the postmistress, waving an envelope in her hand. "Mr. Beresford, Mrs. Beresford, telegram just arrived, marked urgent." Tommy accepted it, tipping his hat. The envelope was thin, the paper crisp. He tore it open and read aloud, "From Wilmot's estate. Trust only the widow." For a moment they both sat silent. Then Tuppence gave a slow, amused smile. "Well," she said, "for once we did." Tommy leaned back against the seat, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his tone. He'd be pleased to know it, I think. His final message, delivered a bit late, but accurate. She tucked her hand through his arm. "And we, my dear, have earned our breakfast twice over." He laughed. "Then let's claim it before someone sends us another ghost by post." The car rolled forward, crunching softly over the gravel. Behind them, Widow's Lodge stood quiet against the pale sky, no longer haunted, merely remembered. As the village lane curved out toward the open road, Tuppence glanced back one last time. "Do you suppose," she said thoughtfully, "that all betrayals begin as good intentions?" Tommy smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Probably, but the world would be dull if everyone kept them." She gave a mock sigh. "You'd miss the excitement, wouldn't you?" He squeezed her hand lightly. Terribly. The wind caught her scarf, sending it fluttering behind her like a banner of truce. The morning sun broke through the clouds, pale, uncertain, but growing stronger, and ahead of them the road opened wide and empty, waiting.